Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Overthinker's Guide to Love. It's Elena, and I'm so happy you're here with me today. And first, I have to say thank you to everyone who voted on Instagram earlier this week for this week's episode. The poll was actually so close; it kept going back and forth, and honestly, I had no idea what topic was going to win until the very, very, very end. But in the end, you all chose why do I replay conversations over and over in my head? And a little confession before we get into the psychology part of this episode. I actually don't think replaying conversations is something I struggle with in a way that causes me a lot of stress. I know that might sound surprising coming from me, who has a podcast about overthinking every little thing in their lives. In fact, it's kind of embarrassing, but I actually use replaying conversations to help me fall asleep at night. Um, Instead of like counting sheep, I'll think back to a conversation I had earlier in the day or maybe from a year ago, and I'll just replay it in my head until I drift off to sleep. I have my sleep mask, my white noise, and we're playing these conversations, and then I fall asleep. I've really been noticing it this week when I was doing this topic and researching it, and like, oh my gosh, like this is what I'm doing when I go to sleep. Um, and maybe that's completely normal, or maybe it's a little weird. Maybe after this episode, I'll realize I should stop doing that. Either way, I figured I'd be honest because even though I don't experience this in exactly the way some people do, um, I've always been fascinated about why our brains seem to hit play on certain moments. Why is it that one conversation can disappear from our memory within minutes while another gets replayed 100 of times? Why do we suddenly remember something we said 3 years ago while we're trying to fall asleep? Me, but it's in a good way. Um, and why do these conversations always seem to sound so much worse in our heads than probably they did in real life? That's exactly what we're going to talk about today. So, why do we replay conversations? Most people assume it's because they're overthinkers, but it's actually only part of that. The truth is, your brain isn't replaying a conversation because it wants to annoy you. It's replaying it because at some level, it thinks there's something important to learn from it. Our brains are prediction machines, and we've talked about this in the past episodes. Every single day, they're thinking questions like, how did that interaction go? Did I fit in? Did I say the right thing? Is there anything I should do differently next time? From an evolutionary perspective, this makes a lot of sense. Thousands of years ago, being accepted by your group wasn't just nice to have. It was a necessity. It was necessary for survival. If you were rejected by your tribe, your chances of surviving drop dramatically. Even though we don't live in that world anymore, our brains still treat social situations as incredibly important. That's why one awkward conversation can stick with you for hours or even years. Your brain isn't just reviewing what happened, it's trying to protect you from future rejection. But here's where things get a little interesting. Your brain doesn't really know the difference between solving a problem and endlessly thinking about a problem. It thinks that if it keeps replaying the conversation long enough, eventually it finds the perfect answer. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. Maybe I talked too much. Maybe I sounded awkward. Maybe they think I'm weird. Maybe I should have said this instead. The problem is that the conversations are math equations. Like, there usually isn't one perfect response. There isn't one magical sentence that would have changed everything in the conversation. And yet our brains convince us that if we just replay it and it one more time, we'll figure it out. Another reason we replay conversations is because our brains hate uncertainty. They hate it. Imagine you text someone and they respond with just, okay, that's it. Immediately, your brain starts filling in the blanks. Are they mad? Did I upset them? Were they busy? Are they losing interest? The truth is, we usually don't know, but uncertainty makes our brains uncomfortable. So instead of accepting that we don't have enough information, we start replaying the entire interaction, looking for clues that probably aren't even there at all. And then there's something psychologists call the spotlight effect. We tend to believe everyone notices and remembers our mistakes far from more far more than they actually do. Think about the last time someone stumbled over their words while talking to you. You probably forgot about it within minutes. Now think about the last time you stumbled over your own words. You might still remember it years later. That's because we're the main character in our own minds. Everyone else is usually thinking about themselves just as much as we're thinking about ourselves. One sentence that really changed the way I think about this is people are really thinking about you as much as you think they're thinking about you. Not because they don't care, but because they're busy replaying their own conversations. So, is replaying conversations always a bad thing? Not at all. In fact, reflecting on conversations is actually a healthy part of being human. It's how we learn, it's how we become better communicators, it's how we recognize when we handled something well and when we could have handled it differently. The problem isn't reflecting. The problem is when reflection quietly turns into rumination. Reflection usually sounds like next time word that differently. I think I interrupted them a little too much. I really liked how that conversation went. You learn something and then you move on. Rumination is different. Rumination doesn't lead anywhere. It just goes in circles. You ask the same questions over and over, but never actually get an answer. And here's something that surprised me when I first learned it. The more emotional a conversation feels, the more likely your brain is to save it as something worth reviewing. That's why we don't replay conversations about ordering coffee. We replay the conversations where we confessed our feelings, the ones where we embarrassed ourselves, the job interview, the disagreement with a friend, the conversations where someone left us unread afterwards. Emotion tells the brain, "Hey, this matters." So, it stores it differently. I've also noticed that the conversations we replay the most are often the ones that we use that never really had an ending. Maybe someone stopped responding. Maybe you never got closure. Maybe you walked away wondering what they actually meant. Our brains love completed stories. When a story feels unfinished, our minds naturally keep returning to it, almost like they're trying to finish writing the ending themselves. Another thing that plays a huge role is your attachment style. If you listen to episode 2, we talked all about attachment styles and how they shape the way we experience relationships. Someone with a more anxious attachment style may replay conversations because they're looking for reassurance. They're asking themselves, did I push them away? Are they pulling back? Did I say something wrong? Someone with a more secure attachment style might still think about the conversation, but they're usually able to accept that they can't know exactly what the other person is thinking. And if you have ADHD, replaying conversations can happen for an entirely different reason. People with ADHD often experience something called rejection sensitivity dysmorphia, or RSD. That means even small moments of perceived rejection or criticism can feel incredibly intense. So, a conversation that someone else forgets 5 minutes later might stay with you for days because your brain keeps trying to understand what happened. What's important to remember is that replaying conversations doesn't automatically mean you're insecure. It doesn't automatically mean you have anxiety. It definitely doesn't mean something is wrong with you. It usually means your brain is trying to protect you. The problem is that sometimes our brain use outdated signals or strategies. They believe that if they just think hard enough, they'll prevent the future pain. But life doesn't work that way. Sometimes there isn't another clue to find. Sometimes there isn't another meaning hidden between the words. Sometimes the healthiest thing we can do is accept that we already have all the information we're ever going to get. So, how do we stop replaying conversations when you know it's becoming unhealthy? The first thing I want you to know is this: you don't have to stop the thought. You just have to stop treating every thought like it's a fact. Just because your brain says you sounded awkward doesn't mean you actually did. Just because your brain says they're definitely mad at you doesn't mean it's true. Our brains are constantly making predictions. Sometimes they're accurate and sometimes they're completely wrong. One question that has helped me is this: what advice do I actually have? What evidence do I actually have? Now, not what I'm imagining, not what I'm afraid of. What do I actually know? If someone smiled, laughed, kept the conversation going, or texted you after, those are facts. Everything else might just be a story your brain is creating to fill in the gaps. Another thing that helps is setting a limit. This might sound strange, but if your brain really wants to think about the conversation, let it. Ask yourself, what did I learn? Is there anything I would genuinely do differently next time? If the answer is yes, great, you've learned something. If the answer is no, then you've reached the end of the lesson, you've reached your limit. Anything after that usually isn't learning anymore. It's just your brain pressing replay. I also think it's important to remember that perfection doesn't exist in conversations. Real conversations are messy. People people interrupt each other. They lose their train of thought. They tell stories that go nowhere. They laugh at the wrong time. They accidentally say something they wish they could take back. That's part of being human. Most of the time, people you're worried about impressing aren't expecting perfection from you. They're just looking for someone who feels genuine. And maybe the biggest reminder I can leave you is with this: the version of the conversation that lived in your head is probably not the same version that lives in theirs. Replaying it from your perspective, they're living from theirs. The sentence you wish you hadn't said might not have even registered to them. The awkward pause you're obsessing over have lasted 2 seconds. The thing you think ruined everything may not have changed anything at all. So, if you've been carrying around one conversation for days, weeks, or even years, I hope this episode reminds you of something. You are allowed to learn from your past with living in it. You're allowed to care about how you show up without expecting yourself to be perfect. You're allowed to let a conversation end, even if your brain wants one more replay. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of The Overthinker's Guide to Love. And thank you again to everyone who voted on Instagram. I love getting to make episodes about the topics that you're genuinely curious about. So keep sending me your ideas because there's a good chance they'll end up becoming an episode. Until next time, be curious with your mind and gentle with your heart.